Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to my little channel here on the interwebs. As I've been mentioning this all this week, I'd like to grow my channel. So if you could just share my content, that would be awesome. If you want to subscribe, hit the like buttons in all platform. That would also be awesome too. At the very minimum, you could just smash the like. It really helps the algorithm, so I've been told. But that's with that out of the way. Let's get to the topic on hand. Is did the parties really flipped? And based on my research, which pretty much consists of this Reddit post, which was done about 4 years ago, so it's probably not really riddled too much within political biases. Now it's a really long thread, and I'll probably put it in the descriptions down below so you can take a look. But it was definitely an extremely interesting read. And pretty much from what I gathered, is that the parties didn't necessarily switch, um, except on one thing. From what I could tell, is you had Lincoln, which was the first Republican president, which was for more federal control. And of course, you had the Democrats, which was known as the Confederates. I think they were the Confederates that turned to Democrats that were for states' rights. Now, of course, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty over what those states' rights are because I think everybody knows. But that's why I keep that in mind when it transcends. So, over the period, according to this, now both parties have changed a lot, according to what this thread has pretty much said. But the big difference with how the parties flip is at the federal government versus states' rights. Now, over the period, the Republicans have become more of advocates for state rights over federal rights, whereas the Democrats have become more federal rights over states' rights. Now, I'm just going to read this, the first one right here. I'm sure it may seem like a bad question. My dad and I are in an argument about factual integrity to this and want to know for sure if it is accurate and how it happened. My father will not agree, but nevertheless, I am curious. Party flip flop. Is it true that the initial Republican parties are the Democrats of today and vice versa? This person, of course, is no longer here. He's deleted, so I don't have to really blop him out. This is a copy and paste from one of the things I wrote over at Ask Historians to a similar question, asking about the switch in conservatism into progressivism in the Republican Party and the Democratic parties. The short answer is as not so simple. And reading from this, like I said, I'm not going to take this as truth or a gossip, but it's just something to ponder. Because, Reddit's really known for its accuracy, but it's probably going to be the most accurate explanations that you're going to be able to get with probably the least bias. Because if you talk to Republicans, they're going to say they haven't. You talk to liberals, and they're going to say, of course, we're the party of the people. We want to make sure we're progressive. We're here for all the groups, the ABCs. We're in it for all the rainbow people. See, we're just like Lincoln. But I don't think that's an entirely true statement. So the problem is by using conservative and progressive in relative terms instead of the ideological constraints. By the definition of conservatism seeks to generally maintain the current establishments. In contrast, progressive seeks to move beyond the current state, which is also kind of a that's probably a different way of putting it as well too, because you get the people that want to keep the tradition, you want those that wants to break from the tradition, and I don't think the Republicans as itself wants to keep with traditions, but there's certain elements that's within their culture that they do want to keep, whereas the Democrats pretty much want to change how we're run through the voting laws as well, and also there's it's not really a tit for tat; it's more of an overgeneralization and simplification. When we think about the 1860 conservatism in the United States, in which was sought to preserve were largely states' rights and institutional of slavery, perhaps the best document we can use to show is what's being conserved in the Mississippi Declaration of Secession. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery and with the greatest material interest of the world. There is no choice left us but to submission to the mandates of the oblation or the dissolution of the Union, whose principles have been subverted to work out our ruin. Utter subjugation awaits us in the Union. If we should consider no longer to remain in it, it's not a matter of choice but necessity. We must either submit to degradation or we must secede from the Union framed by our fathers to secure this as well as every other species or specks of property. Whereas the Republican Party specifically stated in the opposition of the expansion of slavery, we deny the authority of Congress of a territory legislature or an individual to give legal existence to slavery in any territory of the United States. So this really kind of stems to kind of the one of the main reasons why the Civil War kind of kicked off, and why slavery is up to perceived to be the cause of it is when we actually had new states that were forming. The northern people or the Abe Lincoln said any new state that's going to be founded is going to be a free state, which offsets the kind of the equalization of power between free states, which will have no slaves, and of course, slave states, which will own slave as property. And this is almost kind of like the catalyst or the camel that broke the camel back was the federal government was going to prohibit new states from being slave states. Then, of course, Lincoln, being the person he was, between those two things, kind of really kicked it off and caused the South to secede. In the Democratic Party controlled areas in the Deep South, we were fighting to maintain the institution. The switch to many people refer to, about which you have asked, is most commonly placed as the occurring in the 1960s under the administration of Lyndon Johnson. The difficulty with this is calling the actual switch in platforms. There's little to no evidence that the Republican Party became the bastion of the former Jim Crow Southerners. Their ideology is simply dying off as representative of the old guard and the Democratic Party represented by such people as George Wallace, Bull Connor, Storm Thunberg, and Robert Byrd, which I think our wonderful president gave him the eulogy when he died. And he was a high-ranking member of the KKK. I don't know exactly what rank he was. I think it was some type of Cyclops, not the Grand Wizard, because I guess there's no rank called Grand Wizard. But he still was not necessarily a founding member, but a high-ranking member of the KKK and also part of the Democratic Party. When we use conservative and a liberal in the contemporary sense, we are talking about very different things than we were in 1860. The Republican Party became the Conservative Party as they became a party focused on maintaining the institution prior to the FDR New Deal. Since the era of Reagan, especially, the Republicans have been characterized with the underlining devotion of the free market. Since the time of the FDR, the Democratic Party began to shift towards what he called an enlightened government or the creation of a large centralized welfare state. Let's be real, both parties want a large welfare state. It's just that they want to be the ones in control. If we're keeping it 100, the Republicans seem to have moved more heavily towards the idea of free markets since the nomination of Barry Goldwater in 1964. He became an influence on later Reagan administration, which would have drawn contrast distinctly from Eisenhower administration, maintaining that the massive tax system and the New Deal programs, which Roosevelt has instituted to show the thoughts of Eisenhower, which dramatically in contrast has perceived the notion of the Republican Party through the 80s. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you will not hear from that party again in our political history. There's a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes that you can do these things, and their numbers are neglectable and they are stupid. I guess that's a quote from Eisenhower, which I can't agree. I mean, you don't really want to get rid of Social Security, even though I think it's probably a good idea to get rid of it since it's supposed to be temporary. But now that it's ingrained into our society, it should stay and we should find a way to keep it going. But I do understand that's a whole new can of worms. The conservative liberal switch largely comes down to a shift of focus of issues and largely occurred between the time that FDR and Barry Goldwater, while the Democrats began to pursue the expansion of the state towards the idea of a welfare state liberalism, the Republicans, especially under Goldwater and then later Reagan, sought back to the days prior to the New Deal and took up the banner of laissez-faire liberalism or the modern American conservative. That in association with the past figures such as Calvin Coolidge. And of course, he does the sources Mississippi Declaration causes secession January 9th, 1861. The Republican Party platform of the 1860s, section 7 through 10. Dwight Eisenhower letter to Edgar Eisenhower, November 8th, 1954. Then, of course, FDR Commonwealth Club address, September 23rd, 1932. Access, September 14, 2016. The Republican Party platform of 1964, section, subsection of fiscal irresponsibility. John Henderson, Calvin Coolidge, and Ronald Reagan. Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, October 2014, access in 2016. Then, of course, we have this person right here, says largely correct until the 1990s. Much of the work has since been done by political scientists. There are some details missing. The Southern Democrats were the Democrats because the Civil War was basically the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party as it was in 1860. The Republican carpetbaggers are basically the Republican military occupation of the South led to a still Democratic South well into the 20th century. The comment on the pre-FDR policy are largely correct, but vague. The South after the Civil War had changed its entire economy model, which largely had been agriculture. It then tried to sharecrop, or in the cases of families that amass some considerable wealth along the side of slavery, livestock, and other commodities, wanted to live in a aristocratic life like they did pre-Civil War. The new laissez-faire policies of the Republican parties in the late 19th century aligned pretty closely with the views of the Southern Democrats. Do what you want economically, base pay on the free markets, and so on many issues. Southern Democrats were actually more Republican than Democrat. It is important to note that the Democratic Party was not very blocked, or was not very liberal until much later into the 20th century, so most of its strength was from the Southern Bloc. In the 1940s, there was a rise of Northern liberals joining the Democratic Party, and they became increasingly disgruntled. If you look at some of the bills passed during this time, the voting bloc that has always got what it's wanted was the Southern Democrats, but that does not mean that the other Democrats were getting what they wanted. Much like the silver Republicans in the late 1890s, there were niche issues, the voters that were largely keeping the Jim Crow, low wages, no Social Security for a service worker, read black workers, and with the Republicans or the Democrats as they did it. Most political scientists considered Southern Democrats a political voting bloc because you need that bloc to get anything done in Congress. The fall of the Southern Democrats aligned with the 1960 voting rights legislation. At this point, the Democratic Party had become very liberal and very sick of the Southern position on many issues, and if it were put to Southern Democrats on the political spectrum, they would be much closer to Republicans at this time than liberal Democrats, except at some select issues. However, the exodus of the Southern Democrats did not come immediately. Some left and others remained Democrats because they were born shortly after the Civil War, 1880s to 1900s, and had been born with hatred of Republicans. The rise of Newt Gingrich in the 1980s aligned with the rise of the Southern Republicans. The former conservative Southern Democrats retired or died in office, slowly being raised by the new generation of Southern political whose views were barely different than the Southern Democrats, but chose not to run as Democrat because of the Voting Rights Acts in the late 1960s. The change being red states actually comes around 1990. If you look at the districts by district, change over time, in the South. At this point, the Republican Party was being slowly transformed into the brainchild of Newt Gingrich and his conservative caucus. We'll see the result of this in the 1994 with the contract with America. Note that Gingrich was representative of Georgia. I mean, this is really long-winded, and I'm pretty much going to stop there. I think you kind of get the point where the parties actually have changed over time, for better or worse. They've evolved on certain issues. But I think the biggest change, or the biggest thing that they flipped on, was the federal government versus state rights. Whereas right now you got Republicans that are going to be for state rights, and the Democrats being for a big federal government. I mean, with that being said, hopefully you kind of got a glimpse onto how and why people are saying this and why it's not a simple answer with that short, brief reading. Leave a comment down below on what your thoughts are. Of course, smash the like and subscribe button. If you want me to continue this, leave a comment down below. If you want me to continue reading it, I mean, this really is a long read, but I'll put the link down below. And with that being said, have yourself a wonderful day, morning, or evening.